You're listening to the Good Question Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Our goal is to make each of our guests exclaim, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. Because when that happens, it means you, the listener, may be inspired to learn more beyond the interview and to ask great questions yourself that lead to new insights. In this podcast, we cover historical and current anthropology, comparative religion, and history. Welcome, and let's get started.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs, and you're listening to the Good Question Podcast. Today I have John Corrigan. He's the Lucius, Moody, Bristol Distinguished Professor of Religion, also a professor of history, a distinguished research professor, all at Florida State University. And we're going to talk about his work. So he teaches American religious history. Research focuses on religion and emotion, religious intolerance, and I don't know what this means, but spatial humanities. We'll get into that. So, John, thank you for coming.
Good afternoon, Rich.
Well, tell me a little bit about your background. How did you end up at, Florida State, and how did you end up teaching what you teach? What's a little bit of your history?
Well, as an undergraduate, I studied English literature and history, and I wrote a senior thesis on William Blake and Blake's ideas about the afterlife and how his poetry represented some of his thinking about those kinds of magical things. And when I decided I wanted to go to graduate school, I wanted to kind of go in that direction. And so I began to study religion as it's represented in literature, but eventually got more interested in the historical side of things. And so studied history of religion in America, basically, which in the program that I went to at the University of Chicago was a very interdisciplinary program. So there was a lot of studying of theory, a lot of studying of perspectives drawn from a range of disciplines. And I ended up zeroing in on emotion and what emotion has to do with religion and how we can go about studying it and how we can go about theorizing it.
So today, what percentage of Americans espouse some kind of faith versus, let's say, historically?
It's a complicated question, actually. In terms of the numbers of people who are adherents to a recognized religion, those numbers are dropping. They're dropping very rapidly, especially in the last 20 years are dropping rapidly. You especially see a diminishment of that kind of religious affiliation in big cities. So places like, for example, Seattle or Portland or San Francisco or New York, Chicago, other big cities, but regions of the country as well. You see this drop of interest in being affiliated with a religion, a very substantial drop with large numbers of people indicating on questionnaires, the gold standard questionnaires, which are organized by several very good survey operations. Those numbers drop very rapidly, and the numbers of people who are affiliated. However, the number of people who say that they still recognize some kind of wonder or awe in existence, or who find something enchanting about the world, those numbers stay relatively stable. And sometimes those are people who don't want any kind of formal or religious affiliation, but have their own kind of handmade religious perspective, if you want to call it religious. They have a sense of their connectedness to something bigger than them, whether it's nature or the universe or their community or something like that. They have ideas about ethics that they ground in, sometimes traditional texts. They have ideas about transcendence, about all kinds of things. So your question, I'm not trying to very unskillfully dodge it. I'm just trying to say your question is a good one because it has a complicated answer. Religious affiliation is certainly falling in the mainline.
Well, okay, when you say religious affiliation, is that organized religious affiliation or all, even these private practices or these private thoughts about ethics, morals, spirituality, etc., are they all dropping, or is it more the organized religion stuff?
No, what people call organized religions, I prefer to just say institutional religion. That affiliation is dropping. The number of people who describe themselves on questionnaires as having religious-like sensibilities remains about the same.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so I guess you could say it's a drop, or maybe more accurately, it's a shift. Would that be a better way of saying it, or no?
You could certainly define it in that way, absolutely.
Which religions have you seen are suffering the greatest shift, like Christianity versus Muslims versus others? Like, are some experiencing more dramatic shifts than others?
Yes, Christianity is declining out of all the major religions in America. It's declining most rapidly. You know, some parts of Christianity in America, for example, the old mainline Protestant denominations, which would be, Lutheran and Congregationalist and some Baptist groups and Episcopalians and so forth, those have had a very substantial drop. There are some more evangelical churches that have seen stabilization or a slight rise. Roman Catholicism has been not declining as rapidly as it might, simply because there's been an infusion of people from outside the country who bring a Catholicism with them. And that has to a certain extent kept Roman Catholicism from declining as rapidly as it might. Of course, as probably you'll recall, there was an ongoing, actually, sexual crimes incident with the Roman Catholic Church, and faithful have decided that that is not something they want to be a part of, especially the cover-up of it. And so that has drawn people away from their affiliation with Roman Catholicism. But a large part of this is just about people aging and people who are now becoming of age, not being interested in religion. A lot of people who have filled the pews have gotten very old, and many of them are passing into those years when they can expect to die. So that the loss of numbers has a lot to do with simply the fact that people are dying, and that the young people have much less of an interest in religion. And we have pretty good understanding of some of the reasons for that. And one of the reasons is, which comes up in virtually every poll that's done, is that they are very dissatisfied with the identification of religious groups with politics. Young people are very unhappy with religious organizations that take a very overt political stance on things and become partisan in a way that's very off-putting to young people.
Yeah, it makes sense. One thing I noticed, I don't know if this is accurate, but I'm not a very learned person when it comes to religion. I'm learning some stuff, but I noticed in the movies, what goes for quote unquote religion seems to be Catholicism. There's priests and there's confession and there's nuns and all that stuff. And what I've also noticed, I think, is that a lot of the movies that are about Catholicism are all about demons and, horrible things happening, like the nun coming back from hell to kill people. And it's weird. And then when I look at some of the Christian movies, they seem to be more about something bad happened to them and the family prayed and there was a positive result and they overcame bad things. I don't know if this is applicable to all these movies, but I think it's something I've noticed. It's strange.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think part of the reason that you see a lot of Catholic figures represented or Jewish figures represented in movies is because those traditions are relatively easy to portray on the screen because they have such rich material cultures. You can show priests in their vestments. You can show nuns in their nun gear. You can show all the kind of everything from stained glass to holy water to statues and monuments to church architecture and so forth for Catholics. The same thing for Jews. People recognize the skull cap on somebody. They recognize somebody wearing a prayer shawl. They recognize Jews talking in Hebrew as they participate in their liturgies and so forth and so on. It's easy to represent Jews and Catholics as opposed to Protestants, who sometimes don't have the same kind of material culture that's easy to stage as you can stage Catholic or Jewish material culture. I think that might be part of it.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, but why? I mean, again, maybe I'm wrong. I don't know, but it just seems like there's a lot of the Catholic movies are all about demons and the horror movies essentially. It's weird. I don't know why they're into horror.
Well, Americans love horror movies, and they like to be scared, I suppose. And there's a rich tradition in Christianity that is still very much embodied in Catholic thinking about demons and about exorcisms and about the invisible world of devils, the invisible world of angels too. All that kind of stuff, of course, makes for great drama if that's the kind of screenplay you're trying to write.
Yeah, it's just something I noticed. So what is a non-institutional religion look like if you're Jewish versus if you're Christian or versus if you're Muslim? Does it take different forms, or does it actually take a similar form when people come away from, again, the the institutional side of it and just personalize it?
Well, I think that it can often be very difficult to tell whether someone has a background in Judaism or Christianity or Islam or anything else for that matter, whether their maybe background is a Mormon or something, because a lot of the themes that are very popular among especially young people, being people up into their 30s, I suppose we could say, are common. It's a reverence for nature. It's a sense of compassion. It's an idea about the ethics of connectedness with others. It's about hard work and humility and a number of other things. Those things are shared, I think, across population groups, regardless of what people's backgrounds are. I think sometimes you can tell things, if there's a long history of Jews in America being secular Jews. That is, they really don't go to temple or synagogue, but they still tell, they know some Jewish words, some Yiddish words. They can tell jokes about Jews. They like Jewish cooking. Sometimes, they have.
I think I'm one of those people. Like, we celebrated Christmas, and I grew up. I was supposed to be Jewish, but we didn't really do anything, and we celebrated Christmas for convenience. And I guess I call myself a bad Jew. I don't know a lot about it, and I don't do much about it. But here I am, and I make jokes too, so it fits the profile. Bad
Exactly.
jokes.
Exactly. And I think, those can be people who, have that kind of odd residue of a connection to Judaism. And they're not really Jews in the sense of belonging to a particular Jewish community in their town or city, but they can kind of have a sense of affiliation, more of a kind of secular ethnic Judaism. And they can also at the same time be very into things that, say, non-Jews are, like, love of nature and hiking as a kind of ritual of cleansing, and all the stuff that goes along with whatever the trends are these days. That can all be part of it, but you can still be connected to a tradition in a kind of secular way, if that doesn't sound too paradoxical.
Is there a new religion called spiritualism? Like, has it turned into an ism yet?
Sure. There's an old tradition in America actually called spiritualism, which started in the mid-19th century, which basically came to be understood by most people as attending seances and trying to communicate with spirits, right? People who were dead persons wanted to conjure the dead to communicate with them. And spiritualism became a very big thing, particularly in the American, like New England, the American context in cities and so forth. So that's a different kind of thing than just a sort of general, sense of being spiritual. So to clarify, there's spiritualism as a kind of religious movement or religious phenomenon in the 19th century. It's kind of peters out in the early 20th century. And then there's the other kind of thing, which I think you're referring to, is people who say, I'm spiritual, not religious. And that's been around for a while. That's been around, for, at least 150 years or so, maybe even longer. But it only really became part of our conversation when somebody named it that, spiritual but not religious, in the 20th century, latter part of the 20th century. There's a lot of people like that, I think. People are very attracted in America to spiritual ideas and to rituals that they think are going to enhance their spirituality. There's a kind of generic understanding of spiritual as some kind of admixture of ideas and feelings that connect you with big things, connect you with the universe or something else. So that's been around for a while. And there's all kinds of different ways that people do it. Americans are really DIY when it comes to religion in many ways. They like to kind of pick and choose and put things together in ways that make sense to them. You can talk to the people do polls about these sorts of things. You can talk to Catholics, for example, about what they believe. And there'll be a percentage of them who say they believe in reincarnation or believe in astrology or believe in other sorts of things that officially Catholics are not supposed to believe in. Same thing with Jews, same thing with Muslims, same things with Protestants of all stripes. People kind of assemble these ideas and stack them one on top of each other to make a religious worldview that they're comfortable with. It's very hands-on, very, the derogatory term that people sometimes use to describe Catholics is cafeteria Catholics, and that they kind of pick and choose as they go down the line what ideas, what beliefs, what rituals they like, and they combine them in their own way, in a way that makes sense to them.
Yeah, I recently watched a video on like Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses, and I've been looking at various religions and learning a little bit about them. And it seems like my division, but there are some in which I guess your relationship or your experience with God, as they define it, is direct. And then there's some where people are in the way, and people have like this ladder. If you want to get to the ultimate enlightenment, or if you want to get into God's favor, whoever's favor, we're the ones that decide that. You have to kind of go through us and, jump through these hoops and do these things and to show that you're able to ascend to these higher levels. I don't know if you see that division, but it seems like there's at least those two kinds or major kinds of faiths that I've observed.
I think people and religions, regardless of what part of the world you're talking about, and for the most part, what historical period you're talking about, people associate religious life with a certain kind of discipline. It doesn't always have to be a rigid discipline, but sometimes it is. If you're a medieval monk, you live a pretty disciplined life away in a cell, in pretty severe circumstances and as a celibate person, but people have an idea that a certain kind of discipline is important for spiritual advancement, whether it's meditating every day, whether it's going to church every day, whether it's taking a walk every day, whether it's helping somebody across the street every day, whatever it is, that there's a practice or a habit or a discipline of doing and thinking certain things that gets you ahead spiritually. And I think it's rare to find people who profess a sort of spiritual life who don't have that kind of practice. Something is going to be there, even if it's just reading every day about the beauty of art or whatever it might be that somebody identifies as their pathway. People have some sense of discipline being needed.
So if you were to describe, your average student today that professes that they're, again, spiritual but not religious, or at least they're not into institutionalized religion, what would that description look like, sound like? Like, is there one flavor of these kind of people, or are there many flavors? Again, how would you describe the major types of thought process or belief process today?
Well, I think to put everybody under one umbrella would be to say that these are people who are basically seekers. They're looking for something. That's the common thread. Some have been more, have taken more initiative in searching out things that are unfamiliar to them from their own backgrounds growing up. Others are more content to maybe just whittle down some of the things that they've inherited from their family lives. Others kind of combine those two approaches. But the bottom line is there's a kind of, seeking, I suppose you could say, that they're after. And they're pretty open-minded, I think, most of them, about what might go together with what. They don't separate feeling from thinking as much as maybe previous generations did. They don't separate the truth of science from the truth of religion, if they think there's truth in religion, as much as people might have done previously, although there's somewhat of a backlash against that lately. But they're pretty open-minded, I think, and they want to experiment. They want to see what works for them. It gets back again to this can-do American approach to just about everything, which includes religion. I'm going to experiment, trial and error, see what works for me, and that's what I'm going to have.
So what do you think the future holds? Like, where are the trends taking, religious belief? Where do you think they're headed over the next few years and maybe longer term?
Well, if we go by demographics, I think the trend would be that there'll be less and less affiliation with institutional religion and more of this kind of, call it free-form spirituality. People will still, I think, form communities that are gathered around commonly held beliefs about important things. But I think in the near term, just looking at the demographics, religion is going to become less institutional and more personalized.
What other aspects of it you think are going to become more prevalent? So it's going to become more individual. I don't know, again, like, what do you think the cultural dynamics of this are? Are people that, again, say they're spiritual but not religious, do they tend to hold on to their faith as strongly or as long? Or because it's kind of more of a less prescriptive path, that they tend to wander or fizzle out, or just not really come to like a specific conclusion about their faith.
Yeah, that's going to be a hard call. I mean, we can only, try and get a look into our tea leaves based upon what the circumstances have been in the past. But in the past, it's been more or less standard for people who are interested in shaping some sort of spiritual life for themselves to move many times from one religion to another. There's differing data that comes in depending on the pollster who does this, but I've seen some polls that indicate that adults, by the time they get into their 50s, have had 5 to 6 different religious affiliations. I've looked at numbers that, indicate sometimes more than that, sometimes less than that. But the past is, if we judge by the past has been a record of people pretty much moving from one thing to another. Somebody might start out as a Catholic and become a Hindu, and then try out evangelical Protestantism, maybe end up being a Jew. Americans, again, they're very focused on what's going to work for them, and so they're going to move around from one thing to another. So to answer your question, I think people who are seeking something spiritually, however they define spiritual, are probably going to keep seeking. They're going to move from one thing to another. I think people do get into habits that become comfortable to them, habits of thinking and habits of engaging in their community and other sorts of things that become, ideas become comfortable to them. But they're also, as I say, again, open-minded and seeking, and they're going to probably continue, if the past is a guide to the future, moving around from one thing to another.
Yeah, it's weird. And again, this is just my personal opinion and experience. It seems like atheism is becoming a religion. And what I mean is like this, like a lot of religions that I've seen say, you should worship no other God except me, meaning that their way is the right way and the other ones are wrong. But with atheism, it seems like it's gotten more dogmatic. And, they seem to laugh and ridicule people that don't believe what they believe, which they don't believe. So in that way, it seems to have become a religion of its own, a very different one, but like an anti-religion. Strange.
Yeah, well, atheism or agnosticism, atheists say there's no God, agnostics say we just don't know. Atheists or agnostics seem to be the largest growing group among young people, and in general, one of the largest growing groups in the country. Every few years when good surveys come out, good polls come out, that's the group that has expanded the largest in terms of its numbers. And so growing rapidly. And, sometimes those are people who say, I don't know, but I'm still going to maybe believe in the wonder of the universe. And maybe I still have an idea about reincarnation, and maybe I still have an idea about an ethic of love or whatever it might be that could be referenced to the Old Testament or the New Testament or some other kind of world religions scripture. People, put it all together in their own way, but it's a process that's going to continue to unfold, probably in ways that we're not very clear about yet, but it's going to continue to unfold in the direction it's going.
Yeah, I mean, what else jumps out at you that of the trends you're seeing, of the patterns you're seeing? Like, I would think there's something that makes you, raise your eyebrow or say, I don't understand this. This is weird. Like, anything that jumps out to your mind?
Well, I think what strikes me and what strikes so many people, because it's so obvious, is the ongoing partisanship that we see in some religious groups. Religion in America has, to a certain extent, always been partisan, but there's also been an attempt to try and at least provide a public face that a religious group is not partisan, that it's not going to be just for Democrats or just for Republicans. It's not going to be just for this president and not for that president. That's changed, beginning in the latter part of the 20th century, particularly as people like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson and others came to be important for their social commentary as well as for their religious leadership. There's been a drawing of lines between conservative Christians and other Americans. Evangelical Protestants, many of them were drawn to that particular kind of religious perspective because they thought they had an ethical obligation to get involved politically on campaigns against abortion or campaigns to stop the persecution of Christians overseas, whatever it might be. There are all different kinds of things. But in a sense, got out of control. And it has begun to become apparent that the identification of a certain religious group includes a political partisanship. To be this kind, white evangelical, means you're going to be in favor of this presidential candidate and you're not going to like the other one. So that's a real issue that has emerged in force in the last 40 years, and especially in the last 5 or 6 years. This correlation, politics with religious belonging, with the group that you affiliate with.
I'm sure it'll be a wonderful combination that'll lead to all kinds of good things. I'm just kidding. I was joking. I was going to say, I'm sure it'll end up, the politicization of religion, I'm sure will lead to many wonderful things in the future. I'm just kidding. I don't think it will, but.
Well, no, I take your point because, this is what a theocracy is. Americans are quick to condemn the Islamic theocracies where the religious leaders have controlled the political apparatus because they say that, they're tyrants, they're authoritarian, they're dictators, and so forth and so on. But in a sense, that's the direction they're pointing in. When you combine politics and religion in that sort of a way, you make religious tests and political tests the same. You start to move in the direction of a theocracy, where to be an American means to be a certain kind of religion. To be a good citizen means to be a certain kind of religion. There's a danger in that.
What do you think, I'll call it the virus situation. So what do you think this whole, the past 18 months or so has done? Like what kind of dynamics have you seen change due to it from a religious perspective, from a spiritual religious perspective?
Well, I think what we've seen is the acceleration of trends that were already beginning to be clear, particularly virtual religious community. There's been a kind of step-by-step movement from people gathering together in churches to participate in services together or in synagogues or mosques or whatever. There's been a progression of, for example, broadcasting TV services. Roman Catholics in the 1950s could watch the religious services on TV. There have been such things as drive-in religious services for a long time. You can drive your car to a place and have somebody outside standing up and preaching while you stay in your car. There's that. There's these kind of things that have happened that they're distancing the old patterns of Protestant preaching, whereby, as the old joke goes, the preacher would say, "Now put your hand on the radio and feel the power of God," right? This kind of distancing of the individual from other persons in a community that would meet together body next to body has been going on for a long time. I think that was accelerated during the pandemic. The kind of virtual meetings enabled by Zoom and other platforms, other apps, that has accelerated. It isn't something that it comes out of nowhere. It's something that, was one way or another, I think, bound to happen. So that's a big thing. How is it that religious organizations are going to figure out how to have a virtual community, but yet nevertheless have brick and mortar operations where people gather together next to each other?
Like someone could do a survey, has the whole pandemic, you believe, strengthened your faith or weakened it? What's happened to you during this time? Is anyone doing that kind of mass survey in various countries?
Oh, I see what you mean. Not that I know of, but I'm sure people are doing it, but I don't know of any results yet. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of good papers that are going to be published that have researched that once time has passed where they could gather data and analyze it and put it together in a way that makes sense. I think there's going to be some interesting conclusions one way or the other, maybe contradictory conclusions. My sense is it's going to differ based upon context. I think in some places, we're probably going to find that people felt more connected to their religious community because maybe they could see each other more often. Maybe instead of going to services or gathering once a month. Now it's so easy they could do it every day or once a week or 3 times a week or whatever, because they could do it from their the couch back home. So we might discover that people have a kind of strengthened connection to religion in some contexts. We might also discover that people just don't feel right unless they're actually standing next to another body, and that's taken a toll and they feel less religious. It could go any way, either of those ways along a spectrum.
I mean, you've studied, I guess the history of religion in the U.S. I don't know if you've looked at it, worldwide, but do you know of people that have looked at, let's say, while Nazi Germany was going around, or while, the Great Leap Forward in China, or Stalin, or these other huge, world-changing events, did religion seem to increase or decrease during those? And does that tell us where it might go from here, or where it's gone?
Again, I think it's hard to induce a general principle from all of those previous instances of mass global change. I think in some cases religion has flourished, in other cases it hasn't. During periods of national crisis, maybe called a war, for example, or 9/11 or something like that, there is a tendency for people, at least for a certain time, to be more overtly religious. The staying power of that sometimes is not very much, that it's a kind of a transitory phenomenon. It's not a long-term investment. It's, it depends, really. It really just depends on the context again.
Yeah, what about technology? Technology has reared up and entered our lives like crazy. Smartphones and screens everywhere and all that. Have you observed that that's changed the nature and face of religion and belief and faith?
Yeah, I think it has. Again, the sharing of information that the virtual world allows, the internet and all of the various social media platforms, the sharing of information has really important for the emergence of religious or para-religious groups. Take a look just simply at QAnon, which to me is a kind of para-religious group. People have pretty much a blind faith and rather fantastical claims that are made online by QAnon spokespersons, formal or informal. And it's just this rapid dissemination of these ideas across the internet, across the social media universe, that allows movements like that to grow. I think it really is a kind of para-religious movement. It has certain kind of features that make it look, very much like a religious movement. So it's that kind of sharing of information that really matters. By the same token, for example, when the Roman Catholic Church really began to come under criticism for its handling of the abuse crisis, the ongoing abuse crisis, that information spread around the internet very rapidly, and I think caused people to decide that maybe they didn't want to be Catholic anymore. There's all kinds of ethical questions that religious groups get involved in trying to answer, whether it's about who to marry, who can marry, abortion, capital punishment, other sorts of things that now can be discussed, and can be discussed in overtly religious terms among a great number of people in a great number of ways, like it hadn't been before. So yes, I think your suggestion is a good one, that this kind of sharing of information, including religious information, that is possible because of the internet, is changing the way religions develop.
Yeah, I wonder if technology has, I don't know, I mean, it may have affected religion in the same way it's affected information in general. Like I could pull up a bunch of versions of the Bible in 2 seconds on my phone, and I could look up the Quran, I could look up, the Vedas. I mean, I could look up anything in 2 seconds. So at my fingertips, I have access to all this info, but it may be, I don't know, maybe the reverse, like, people are more connected than ever, but more isolated than ever. So maybe that's what's happened with the information availability in religion. Maybe it's, I don't know, maybe it's pulled it in both directions, and it's really not more or less, but just different.
Yeah, I think that's true. I look back to, as a historical example, the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. And one of the reasons the Protestant Reformation, which was a kind of departure from Roman Catholicism, one of the reasons it was so effective is because it came on the heels of the emergence of the printing press. And with the printing press comes the possibility of the dissemination of materials to people who never would have seen them otherwise. You know, the Protestant ideas, which were written down in treatises and other kinds of texts, were published and circulated throughout Europe. And they were circulated because the technology of information was advanced with the printing press and ways of processing paper and ink and so forth and so on, and just distribution of all of that. And it made a big difference. And apropos your point, one of the differences it made was to split groups apart. You know, with this possibility of new theological opinions printed up and distributed, new ideas, new groups formed around those ideas and pushed off against each other. Protestants in general pushed off against Catholics. And then among Protestants, there were all kinds of different groups, whether they became, you know, eventually Baptists or Anglicans or Huguenots or whatever it might be. All these different Protestant groups, you know, Anabaptist groups, these Hutterites or Amish or whatever, they all pushed off against each other. In the same sort of way, I think you're suggesting that the proliferation of religious information on the internet can lead to the splintering of communities as much as it can serve as reference for people to build communities around.
So, I mean, looking forward, are there any questions burning in your mind that you want to answer? Like, what's the the focus of your work right now?
Well, you know, right now I'm working on religion and race and violence in America. And one of the things I hope that all of us think about a little bit more is to what extent religion and racism are entangled in American history, and how it is that we need to go about critically analyzing that so that we can overcome racism and so that we have a better sense of our own history, you know, how we got to where we are, what religion had to do with that, where the contributions have been, where the kinks have been, what we've buried and don't want to come to terms with, what we should be proud of. All these sorts of things are part of an investigation of the entanglement of religion and racism in America. White supremacism in America is very much mixed up with a certain kind of religion in America, or maybe a certain cluster of religious groups in America. We need to figure out why that is and what the remedy is for that. You know, if we're going to address racism, we have to address all of the things that racism is joined with in our culture. So I'm working on that. I'm thinking about race, I'm thinking about violence, I'm thinking about religion, how all these things, for one reason or another, have gone together. It was no accident that the January 6th insurrection is replete with images of people carrying Christian symbolism alongside Confederate flags, and of people talking about how God had sent them to the Capitol on January 6th to do whatever it was that they were supposed to do. There's an issue there that we need to explore. So I'm hoping to shed some light on that with my current research.
Okay, well, very good. Well, John, what's the best way for people to find out more about your work? Where can they go?
They can just Google me, John Corrigan, and they'll get immediately links to my department webpage at Florida State University. There's a fairly long Wikipedia entry on me that they might see that will come up. I think the answer is just Google me and you'll probably see a lot of things.
Okay. Well, very good. Well, John, thanks for coming on the Good Question podcast. It's been a great call and I appreciate it.
Rich, thanks very much.
Thank you for listening to the Good Question Podcast. Please email support@thegoodquestionpodcast.com if you have any referrals to great guests for us to interview. Visit thegoodquestionpodcast.com to hear more interviews. And please help us spread the word by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to this podcast.